Moving on, we'll be talking about version control techniques. So there are two version control techniques. There's centralized and distributed version control. Centralized version control is also known as a centralized source control or revision control system. It is a server that acts as the main centralized repository which stores every version of code. Some examples are concurrent version systems, which is CVS, Perforce, and Subversion, which is SVN. Distributed version control, on the other hand, is a control system that brings a local copy of the complete repository to every team member's computer so they can commit, branch, and merge locally. Some examples are Git, Mercurial, and Bitkeeper. Here we will be looking at the differences in functionality between centralized and distributed version control systems. So in terms of workflow, for centralized version control systems, developers interact with the centralized repository to commit changes. Distributed version control system, each developer has a local copy of the entire repository and can commit changes to their own local copy. Offline work, developers must be connected to the central repository to commit changes for centralized, whereas for distributed, developers can work offline and synchronize changes later. In terms of speed, centralized is slower because of network communications with the central server is needed for most operations, whereas distributed version control system is faster because most operations are performed locally. Branching and merging can be cumbersome and time consuming because developers must communicate with the central repository in a centralized version control system, whereas in a distributed version control system, branching is easier because each developer has their own local copy of the repository to work on independently. Backup and recovery, the central version control system relies on a single central repository, which can be a single point of failure in case of data loss or corruption, whereas distributed version control system, since each developer has a full copy of the repository on their own local system, this serves as a backup in case the central repository is lost or corrupted. Merge conflicts, multiple developers can be working on the same central repository, leading to more merge conflicts in a centralized version control system. And there are few merge conflicts between developers working on their own local copies of the repository for a distributed system. Moving on to the beneficial analysis between the two version control systems. The pros for a centralized version control system: it is easy to learn and use, especially for beginners. It is easy to set up as there is only one central repository to manage. It is good for smaller projects where developers work closely together, and it generally has better access control and permissions management. Some pros for the distributed version control system: each developer has their own local repository which allows branching and merging and enabling more flexible workflows. It is fast because most operations are performed locally. It is great for larger projects with many developers working on different features, and it is good for teams distributed across multiple locations. Some of the cons of a centralized version control system: it relies on a single central repository, which can be a single point of failure in case of data loss or corruption. It is slower because network communication with the central server is needed for most operations. Branching and merging can be cumbersome and time consuming because developers must communicate with the central repository, and it has limited offline capabilities. Some cons for the distributed version control system: it is more complex and may require more time to learn and use, especially for beginners. Can be more difficult to set up as each developer must have their own local copy of the repository. Can lead to more merge conflicts if developers work on the same files concurrently, and it generally has weaker access control and permissions management.